Thank you all for coming to my talk on creating a component library with Vite, Vue, and Tailwind. My name is Paige Kelley. I am a senior software developer at Pax8 out in Denver, Colorado. So for those of you who haven't heard of Pax8, we are a digital marketplace that helps companies buy, sell, and manage their cloud solution products. At Pax8, I built and currently work on our company's internal component library. So this component library that I work on came about from a need that we had at the company. We needed a uniform set of components that took in our new design system and could be used across our many different micro front-end and standalone application projects. So one of the advantages to having an internal component library is that we could really quickly make and distribute design changes cross-engineering with one central location. So for example, this is actually a real example, our marketing team decides that they want to change like some of our branding colors and some of our fonts. We have a bunch of different applications. So all we have to do now is update those things in our internal component library, publish the new version, and it's available for everybody. So this is just one of the advantages to having the internal component library, and just one reason you might want to build one. There's many others. So in this presentation, I'm going to be going over how to build a component library the best way that I've personally learned how to build one using the stack that I am working with. But before we jump in and start building our component library, we have this tradition at Pax8 that I really love and I like to bring with me to talks. And that is when you join the team for the first time, you give a weird fact about yourself. And since we're building a component library together, we're kind of like a tiny little temporary dev team and we're just meeting. So my interesting fact is my favorite holiday is Halloween. Like I really love Halloween. I know it's not like the most interesting fact somebody could have. It's pretty basic actually. But I was putting my presentation together in October and I thought maybe we could all use our imaginations and go back a little over a week in time and celebrate Halloween all over again. Right? Instead of creating some boring component library, we're going to create a spooky component library with a bunch of scary skeleton loaders in it. All right, so before we could start our project, like any good project, we need to talk to our product manager and tell him what we're building. It's a weird example because in real life he would tell me what I'm building, but we're making believe. So project manager Mr. Bones says, what are component libraries? And I would tell him, Mr. Bones, a component library is really similar to what it sounds like. It's a set of pre-built UI components like inputs, selects, drop-downs, buttons, or for our use case, scary skeleton loaders that could be reused across different projects, and they take in a similar design system. And he's like, that's great, sounds like a good project. We have a lot of different applications that we're gonna need components for. But what if we just want to use a few of our components from our component library? We don't want to be like bringing all of them into every single project. What if we're just building like a landing page that's a form and we only need like inputs and buttons? So what I would tell Mr. Bones is we're going to use something called tree shaking in our library. And what this is the removal of dead code or unused code. So for our component library example, if we only want to bring in the input and the button as the consuming application, we can do that. So he's happy and he's like, okay, so what are some examples of component libraries that I might have heard of that are already out there? And our excited coworker says Aruga, Bootstrap, and Vuetify are a few of the component libraries that are already out there and available in our Vue ecosystem. All right. So now we're ready to start building our component library. Our first step is we're going to generate a Vue application. And for my project, I chose to do this with my new favorite build tool, which is Vite. For those of you who haven't heard of Vite, it is a super fast open source build tool that works with not only Vue, but also a few other of our favorite frameworks like React, Preact, Svelte, Lit, and you could even use it with vanilla JavaScript projects. If you want to learn a little bit more about Vite, there is a link below. So the first thing we're going to do is run our create command. So you run npm create Vite. When you do that, it'll give you a list of options to walk through. First, project name, we're naming ours Vue Components. The framework that we're working with in this demonstration is Vue. And the variant we're using is JavaScript, but if you want TypeScript, you could do that too. Once you've run these commands, you'll notice that a folder has appeared wherever you ran them. You're going to cd into that folder. So cd into view components, run an install, and then run dev. Once you've done this, the default Vite and Vue application will be up and running in your local host, and it should look exactly like this. Okay, so now we have our application up and running. Our next step in building a component library is we're going to install Tailwind CSS. But before we do this, I need to let you know that Tailwind is not a requirement when you're building a component library. It's just part of my stack. I've really enjoyed working with it. For those of you who have never heard of it, it is a utility-based CSS framework, and what that means is you use utility classes right inside of your template to quickly design your applications, or in our case, components. So just curious, show of hands, who's worked with Tailwind before? There's a few people. I saw your hand up, Homer. All right, so there are a few different ways that you can install Tailwind. Double animation in there. All right. So the first way that you can install Tailwind, if you're looking at their doc site, they have a CLI, which is their recommended way, and that works great for applications. They have a CDN, and that is good and recommended for development mode. And what I've found to be best if you're building a component library with Tailwind is to use PostCSS. For those of you who haven't heard of PostCSS before, you've probably actually used it. It's a dependency in a lot of really popular tools that are out there today. What it is it's a CSS processor that uses JavaScript to transform your CSS, and it works with a bunch of different plugins to make it do exactly what you want it to do. So here we're using Auto Prefixer, which takes care of browser prefixes. So if you're following along in the Tailwind documentation, you might also notice that I've snuck in an extra dependency here, and that's the PostCSS CLI. We're going to use this later on in the demonstration, and what it does is it allows you to access PostCSS from your command line, and I'll show you when we're using it. So let's run our install. When I ran my install, these were the versions of the packages that I got. Next up is we're going to create our Tailwind CSS file. So at the root of your source folder, you're going to create a file called Tailwind CSS and copy in these 3 lines of code. So let's talk about what we're doing here. So here we're using something called the Tailwind directive to bring in all of our Tailwind class layers. So the first layer is our base, and what that is it is a CSS reset. In Tailwind, they use a file called preflight, and that's going to normalize all of your styles across browsers and make everything kind of look the same. Then next is your components layer. That's where all of your components-based classes are going to go. And last, utilities. That's where we're going to get all of those utility classes that you're going to see us use a little later on inside of our HTML. One of the cool things about these layers is you could actually extend them. So I'm going to extend my base layer to add styles on my body. And what I'm doing here is I'm giving a little bit of dark mode support to the consuming application by giving it a background of white, a text of dark gray, and then I'm using something in Tailwind called the dark selector. And what that does is it'll override anything it's put in front of when the user has a browser setting of dark mode selected. One of the other good things about this is the consuming application can override any of these styles. So you're not like tied to them. I just think it's like a good base for dark mode. All right, so now we're going to import in these styles into main.js so we could use them while we're building. If you open up your main.js file that was generated by Vite, you'll notice that it looks almost exactly like this, except you have a styles.css file. I just deleted that file and added in my Tailwind classes. Next up, generating the configuration files. If you're following along in Tailwind, you might notice I snuck in that -p. That -p is going to also generate your PostCSS config. So let's open up our Tailwind config that was generated by that command. And what we're doing here is the way Tailwind works is it only generates the classes that you're actually using, but you need to tell Tailwind where to look for those classes. So in this content section, I'm saying in my source folder, go down a level and look for my HTML, JavaScript, and Vue files, and that's where I want you to look for my Tailwind. All right, so application is now up and running. We have Tailwind installed. We're getting really close to the exciting part where we get to design components, at least That's my favorite part, so I think it's exciting. And our skeleton friend says, let's build some skeleton loaders. But before we can do the fun stuff of designing our components, we need to set up our file structure. So this isn't the only file structure you could use when building a component library. It's just the one that I've been using lately, and it's really helped to keep all of my stuff very organized, so I will show it off to everybody. First, we're going to create a folder called components. Nope, we're not going to create it. Vite created that for us. When you open up that folder that had been generated by Vite called components, you'll notice there's a file in there called hello-world.view. We'll just delete that and all references to it. And then what I like to put into my components folder is a folder for my first component. So in here, it might seem a little silly right now because I have a folder called button for my button skeleton loader, and it only has in like one view file and an index to export it out. But this folder structure is really great because you could keep, if you're using Storybook, your stories in here. If you're doing some automated testing, you could keep your test that's related to the specific component right next to it. Also, if you have related components that your main component is dependent on, it could go in this folder too. So this folder structure has been great for me. So let's look at the files in it. So first we have our button.view. This is just where our skeleton button code is going to go really soon. Next, we have our index.js, where we're going to import in that code from the button.view and export it out as sButton. I'm exporting it out as sButton because that is the value I want the consuming application to have access to. All right. Next, we have one more file that we need to go over, and that is an index.js that's going to be in the root of our components folder. This is just going to export out all of our individual components together. It's looking a little empty right now because all we have in here is a button component. So let's add some more components. Now you can see if you look in the components folder, I've added in a card skeleton loader and a shape skeleton loader. I'm not going to go through all the code for that because it's exactly the same as the button right now. But I will open up my index.js. And now you can see we have a few more components. We're starting to have more of a component library. That's pretty exciting. It's almost time to design our components. But before we do, an important step of designing something is to understand what it is. So let's take a second and talk about what skeleton loaders are. I know most of you have probably seen them before, but let's do it anyway. So what a skeleton loader is it is a placeholder for some either data or a component or even a whole page that hasn't loaded yet. It usually uses like a subtle color and a subtle animation, so you hardly notice it while your page is loading. There's actually been a few studies done that show that users have a shorter perceived wait time when they're looking at skeleton loaders and skeleton loader pages over like your traditional bouncy loader or spinny loader. Yeah, and a lot of popular applications use skeleton loaders, like Spotify, Discord, this example of YouTube. And now if you're paying attention to this presentation, you will see skeleton loaders literally everywhere. It's like a new problem I have. They used to be doing their job. They were like subtle in the background. But now I see them everywhere I look. All right, so we know what skeleton loaders are now. It's time to design our components. So the first one we're going to do is our skeleton loader button component. Our component library components are really similar to application components. So mine is taking in a prop of is loading, and what this is going to do is it's going to tell the component whether to load or not. This props is like a pretty powerful thing that you could use with the components. You could really customize your components by bringing in different props. So this is a button component. I'm only bringing in loading here, but you can kind of imagine the possibilities with this. I could be passing in like is expanded, and we could have a full width button. If our design system has like more pointy edges than rounded, we change the border radius, the shades of gray, all kinds of stuff. You could just customize with those props. Our next section we're going to look at is role. I put this in for accessibility. This was my best go at it. I Googled what the accessible role for skeleton loaders was, and what I found in a few different places was the progress bar because it is a placeholder for content that's going to be loading. The next thing we're gonna look at is our classes. So if you've never used Tailwind CSS, this might look a little weird to you, but what this is it's our utility classes being used right inside of the template to style our button. So here, I'll just kind of quickly go over what these things are doing. W28 is giving it a width of, I think, 7 rem. H12 is giving it a height of, I believe, 3. Rounded is our border radius that's giving it that pill shape, and then the background of that light gray. So you could really build out your component styles with these utility classes. Next, we have our animate pulse. So Tailwind is pretty cool because it provides like quick animations. So some of these defaults are pretty useful if you don't have anything super specific you want. Before with animations, we used to have to like set keyframes and tell it what opacity I wanted it to pulse to and from. Now I just have 2 words with a little dash in between and I have my animation. Last, we're using our dark selector again because we want our skeleton loaders to be subtle. We're darkening up the background of it. We have a few more components in our component library, but I'm not going to go through the code for every single one because that would also be pretty redundant. Same thing, different shape. Here's our card loader. It's just mimicking the place of where a card would be. And next we have our shape component. Our shape component, or our shape skeleton loader component, is just like a little placeholder for like either the top bar, the sidebar, or the footer. So just a few skeleton loader components. Side note, I'm not a professional in skeleton loaders. I don't know if it's practical to build a full skeleton loader component library. A lot of component libraries you'll find out there, like Vuetify, have skeleton loaders as just one component that you could reuse, but it went with my pun of components, so we're going with it. All right, our next step is really important. We're finally getting into the parts of this presentation that really make our component library a component library. So we're gonna create a really important file, which is our entry file. This is gonna tell the component library what we wanna build out and expose to the end users. So at the root of your source folder, you're gonna make another index.js file, and this is going to be our entry file. So let's take a look at what that code looks like. So in our entry file, we're going to import in all of our components from that components folder that we created earlier. Then we're going to create a value called viewComponents, and this is what we're going to be exporting out to the consuming application. So what it's doing is it's taking in all of those components, it's iterating over them and installing them on the Vue instance to make them into a plugin. And if we weren't supporting tree shaking, I'd say we're good, let's move on. But since we are, we also need to expose our individual components to the consuming application. So we're exporting out our button, card, and shape from their components folders as well. So that is our entry file. Those are the things that we're going to be exporting out. So one global package with all of our components on it, the Vue components that could be registered on the Vue application and used throughout your consuming app, and then individual components as well. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up our Vite config. And what we're doing inside of our Vite config is we're telling Vite build how we specifically want it to build our component library out. So if you open up your Vite config, you'll notice that it just has this plugins in it right now. So that came default when we ran our Vite create. It has the Vue.js plugin from Vite, so it works with that. But we're not going to go into that one too much because it's already there and we're not doing anything to it. What we really need to look at is this build section. So what we're doing here is we're telling Vite that we want to build in library mode, and we need to set a few things to make it work. First, we need to tell it where to look for our entry file. So we're going to point it to the root of our source at that index.js file that we just built in the last section. Then we need to tell it what formats we want our entry file to be built out in. So I'm building mine out as ES modules and CommonJS. This ES format is really important if you want to support tree shaking. If you do not have it, you cannot support tree shaking. Next, our file name. So we're just telling it what we want to build out that entry file as. So I'm telling it vue-components.es.js and .cjs.js. So pay attention to those files because they're going to be really important in our next slide. The last thing we need to do to our Vite config before we move on is set some roll-up options. So I had a lot of fun playing with these. Remember earlier when, I didn't mention, Vite uses rollup, and that has made it really easy for me to configure this library for tree shaking. So here are some of the options that we're going to be playing with to do that. So first we're going to look at this external with Vue in it. So what this is doing is it's telling rollup that we don't want to bundle in Vue with our component library. Instead, we want to make it an external dependency that's required at runtime. So if you play with these rollup options a little bit, like I did, you could comment them out. So like comment out external and then run your build, and you'll notice a node modules folder will appear in your dist folder. And then if you have this externals, you don't get it. Having Vue build in with your component library can cause a lot of problems if the consuming application already has Vue installed on it. So I recommend adding in this external section. Next, our output, we're setting it to preserve the modules. And what that's doing is it's preserving the module structure of our individual components to support tree shaking. Next, our export's named. Because our entry file is exporting out more than just one thing, we need to have this export's name value in here as well. So if you're playing with this, I recommend like comment out some of this stuff, see how it runs, mess with it, see how your build changes, because this is what's setting up your build for your component library. All right, so that is our Vite config, which is our build. Next, we're going to look at configuring our package.json. So I'm not going to go through every single thing in this package.json because it's kind of, some of it's irrelevant. But what I am going to go through is what we need for our package manager and also our build scripts. So the package manager we're going to be using in this project is npm. Just side note. So the first section here is our name. Whatever you put in here is what the package manager is going to name your component library when you run a publish. So give it a good name. Next, private. If you're publishing to a public place, you need to toggle this over to false. So we did that. Version, you're going to need to bump up your version every time you run a publish or it will fail. So we're publishing version 1 right now. The next thing we're going to look at is our main and module section and the files. So remember a slide ago when we were building out our main and our modules as Vue components.cjs and es? Here's where we're actually going to use them. So we're going to tell our package.json to set our main as our common.js and then our module file as the es.js. You need to make sure you have your module as that es.js file here in order to support tree shaking. Next section is our files. So the package manager isn't going to publish your entire code repository. It's only going to publish the things that you tell it to publish. So we're building out everything into our dist folder. So we're going to tell npm only publish our dist folder. If you have some files outside of the dist folder that you want published, just add them in here and they'll be included as well. So there's one more thing we need to look at for the package manager, and that is our peer dependencies. I really recommend not leaving Vue in your dependencies and moving it out into your peer dependencies for your package. Because like I mentioned before, if you end up with multiple versions of Vue installed on the consuming application, you will cause problems for whoever's using your component library. Okay, so that is all of the stuff for the package manager. Next, we're going to look at 2 of our scripts that we need to configure in here, and these are pretty important. So first is our build script. So this is what's going to run when we run npm run build. So what this is doing is it's actually just running 2 other scripts. So it's going to run Vite build, which we configured in our Vite config, and then it's going to run build styles, which we're going to talk about now. So our build styles is using PostCSS. Remember earlier when we were installing Tailwind, we snuck in that Tailwind CLI. This is where we're actually going to use it. So we're going to use PostCSS to process in our Tailwind CSS and output it into our dist folder as index.css. This is going to allow our consuming application to access the index.css and get all of our styles from our component library. All right, so those are our scripts. Okay, we're getting really close to having a component library. We're on our last step, which I think is the most exciting, actually publishing it. So here's our excited friend, we did it. The first thing we're gonna do is run our build script. So we just set up our build script so we know what it's doing. It's running Vite build and it's running build on all of our styles. So let's run ours, and as you can see, because we have the preserve modules, we're getting all of our individual components as well as our full component library. And at the bottom, we're getting our outputted index.css. So that looks like a good build. The next thing we're gonna do is we're going to publish to NPM. So if you've never published to NPM before, you're going to need to log on to npm.com, create an account, and log into it on your terminal. Assuming you've done all that, you could run npm publish, and if it's successful, you'll get the name of your component library and the version that you've published. You could go on to npm.com or npmjs.com and see your component library ready for anybody to install and use it. Pretty exciting. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So I have a kind of hand-rolled doc site here called Spooky App, and I'm going to install my component library on it. And it's going to work. Then I'm going to run npm run dev, and now I have my test application been running here. So let's take a look at what that's looking like. I'll be person 1 right now, and I've got stuff. All right, so let's go to that local host. And oh no, a spinny loader, and it's making me feel like it's taking forever for my Vue components doc site to load. So let's fix that by using our component library that we just built. So the way we're going to actually use our component library is first we're going to import in the styles. Remember that index.css that we created? Importing that in now. Then next, remember our global Vue components that we set in our entry file? That is the value that we're going to access here. So we're saying Vue components. And then because at VueConf I forgot to use it and almost ran away off the stage, I put a reminder. So we're going to use our component library. We have to also set up our components. So this is the app page for that demo. And as you can see, it's not actually taking forever to load. I put a set timeout on fetching my stuff from a JSON file. But we're going to use a skeleton page. And inside of the skeleton page, we're going to use a few of our skeleton components to kind of mock out that layout that we had on the page before. So we have our S shape for the header and some text. We have our S buttons. Remember, we're exporting out S button. That's the S dash button that we get to use now. And 3 of our cards to kind of mimic it. So make sure I have everything. Okay. So now we could go over to our application page, refresh it, and wow, that looks so much better. And we feel like we're not waiting at all for it to load. And we're happy. Now let's check it out. It supports dark mode. So let's go into our system preferences and change them to dark mode. Wow, so pretty. And I got fancy and added some orange in because the other color you could hardly see. So it's supporting dark mode now, but let's test out our tree shaking, which I think is the exciting part. So if we go back in to our main.js, let's uninstall this globally. And as you can see, it was 1.6 here. So let's stop using it. We need to keep our styles, so get rid of your styles. All right, so now let's say I don't want these button components. Well, first let's see it not working. So you go in here, now our components are not installed globally anymore. We don't have access to them. We could go back over to our skeleton page, and we don't want to use our buttons anymore for some reason. They're gone. And let's just import in our card and our shape. So now we're only using the components that we want. It's a little less stuff to be importing in, and it's not working. Oh, I need to save it. Live coding. It's still not working. It worked this morning. What did I do? I did not save again. Okay. And if you save, then you will see your card and shape components working without globally installing. So now you have tree shaking supported in your component library too, which is pretty exciting. Let's go back to our presentation. So we just used our component library. We have a few other things to consider. First, testing. We built all these cool components. We definitely want to test them and make sure they actually work. There's a lot of great things out there for testing. I'm using VTest in my current project, and that's been working great. Cypress is also a really cool thing to test with. I believe it has like a GUI where you could like see your components being tested in the browser. Used Jest in the past. Lots of great options for testing. Next is accessibility. We build our components. We want to make sure everybody can use them. So go learn more about accessibility and add that into your components. This conference is a great place to learn a little bit more. There's also some really good things outside on the web for you to look at. Last, documentation. No one can read or no one can use your component library if you don't tell them how. So make sure to document your components. So a few thank yous. Thank you to the maintainers at Vue, Vite, and Tailwind, the CC Images, Pax8, and Connect.Tech for putting on this conference. Everybody have fun coding. Here is the link to the GitHub where all of this code is. There is also a link to the NPM package, and if you follow me on Twitter, I will just tweet out these two links so you don't have to type them all out. So thank you all.